resurrection. And referring to the resurrection would be referring to the fact that you are in a body. And he's putting it here that you're in a house, even a tabernacle or in a temple, as Jesus put it. Jesus said, destroy this temple and in 3 days I will raise it up. But he's talking about his body. When Jesus died, he gives up the ghost. The ghost in this same sense is the spirit that's in the body. When God created Adam, he breathed into his nostrils and Adam became a living soul. He became both body and spirit. This is what we are. We're body and spirit, and we've been placed into flesh in a spiritual sense. We are a spirit in this sense, and I can't say what the spirit looks like, but clearly those from that other realm have a way of speaking to people in that you don't always see them, but you know what they're saying. And so there's definite communication as coming from the other realm. And often these visitations that people get, they're not always aware of what the person looks like. Whether it's an angel or even a departed saint, even departed saints have appeared to people. And that is also in the scriptures. Clearly Jesus saw Elijah and Moses, and they were communicating in what was called the Transfiguration. So it's a reality that visitations do come from that other realm. Sometimes they cross that wall into this realm. And the disciples, Peter, James and John, as I recall, saw these, Moses and Elijah, talking to Jesus about his death that he was going to accomplish in Jerusalem. Obviously talking about his death, and then you're going to go on to talk about the death and resurrection, Jesus coming back to life 3 days later. Why would he do that? So that we can do the same. So clearly this vehicle that we've been placed in wasn't meant to die from the beginning, but God obviously knew what man would do. And therefore, clearly every person coming into this world will die. Whereas in God's ultimate plan was not that people should come into life and die, but being human, we all die because we've inherited the sin of Adam, let's say, and this has been passed on. So Jesus, being the second Adam, in this same sense, reversed the process. So in Adam, we all die, but in Jesus Christ, we all live. In other words, we will come back to life as Jesus did. Jesus, dead 3 days, comes back to life. Lazarus, dead 4 days and stinking. Jesus giving us an example of what he can do. And all he had to say, it was a few words, and then in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, Lazarus, he says, come forth. And then suddenly they're moving this, they've already moved the tombstone away. And Jesus, in that very instant moment in time, in the moment of time, in the twinkling of an eye, it says the dead in Christ shall rise first. We can't get our head around this, but we have a story, a true story of Lazarus, which Jesus gave as an example that he indeed is the resurrection of the life. He can indeed raise people back to life, even though they've been dead 4 days and are stinking. And in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, all he had to say was, Lazarus, come forth. And who should walk out of the tomb dressed in all of those rags or whatever they put round the body? And there he was, for every eye to see. You know what this did? This sealed Jesus' fate on earth. When the Pharisees heard that Lazarus had risen from the dead and that the crowds were flocking to Jesus, the cat was out of the bag. Indeed, this is the Christ that we've been waiting for. What did the Pharisees decide? He has to go. So Jesus not only raising Lazarus from the dead, but sealing his own fate. From then onwards, they sought to kill Jesus, and they also sought to kill Lazarus. Well, for we know, says St. Paul, so he's going through all these troubles, trials and tests, and what do? We lift up our eyes and our hearts, and we develop our spiritual leaning, and we're looking forward to the resurrection, a time when we shall be changed in a moment, the twinkling of an eye. So chapter 5, 2 Corinthians chapter 5, for we know that if our earthly house, now he's talking about the body and he's calling it a house. For we know that if our earthly house of this tabernacle were dissolved. So he's calling the body in the Old Testament they had a tabernacle which was like the temple. Before they had the temple, they had what you might call a tent, because they moved around a lot in the wilderness. They couldn't just pick up bricks and mortar and rebuild the temple everywhere they went. So God told them to build a tent. And this was called a tabernacle, which was their temple in the Old Testament. So Paul here is referring to the body, this body that we're all in, as a house or a tabernacle. Jesus called it a temple. So for we know that if our earthly house of this tabernacle were dissolved, so in other words, goes into decay and dies. And back then, people were either burning at the stake, or they would bury them when they died, or these days people are cremated. Either way you look at it, the body is eventually dissolved. So dissolved is a good word. For we know that if our earthly house of this tabernacle were dissolved, we have a building of God. Now he's talking about the body. We have a building of God and house. So he's calling the body a house here. And a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. So can we get our head around that? We have an earthly house, an earthly tabernacle, an earthly body, which Paul is now calling a tabernacle or a house, a temple, in other words, or a house, a building, in other words. For we know that if our earthly house of this tabernacle were dissolved, we have a building, in other words, a body of God, and house, a body not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. So you kind of have the promise of the resurrection in that you have an eternal body waiting for you somewhere or other in the heavens, in the spiritual sense, as coming from the spiritual realm in this sense. You have a body in this sense, in this promise of God, that you will one day dwell in as a contrary to this body, it will live forever. So we have a building of God, in other words, a body of God, and house, and don't forget he's talking symbolically, and house not made with hands. So it's not made with human hands. Houses on earth are made with human hands. This house is made by God, and you could say it's spoken into existence. When God made this world, he spoke it into existence. When God made the sun and the moon and the stars, he spoke the sun, the moon and the stars into existence. So if God can speak a world into existence, if God can say, let there be light, let there be the sun, the moon and the stars, the greater light of all the day, and the lesser light of all the night. If God can create millions and billions of stars, which are bigger than the earth, you can get a million earths into the sun. And you can probably get a million billion suns into many stars. So if God can create these heavenly bodies out there, the sun, the moon, and the stars, if God can create a world, if God can create all of these various fish, and each one of them have a form of a body, if God can speak the word and millions of birds are suddenly flying into the sky, and millions of fish are swimming in the sea, and millions of animals and plants and such are roaming the earth, they all have a form of a body. If God can speak all of these into existence, then God only has to say the word and it's done. So we have a building of God and house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For in this we groan earnestly, desiring to be clothed upon with our house, which is from heaven. So you're in this body, and if you get to certain ages in this life, like I say, 68 years old, you tend to get so many more aches and pains that you didn't get when once you were youthful and running around and doing all those things you did as a child. Suddenly it's not the same no more. So like Paul, for in this we groan. So he's groaning, he wants to get out of the body he's in. He's not so happy in his body that he's in. He's not doing so well. He's getting so many aches and pains in that body. And they do say that Paul was losing sight towards the end of his life. So for in this we groan earnestly, desiring